Today, we're jumping right into what is literally the absolute highest stakes crisis in American history. We're talking about a nation actively tearing itself apart and the extraordinary, really complex figure standing right at the dead center of the storm. We are looking at Abraham Lincoln. This is a leader who didn't just fight to piece a fractured union back together, but who ultimately redefined the very concept of freedom in the United States. It's an incredible, wild journey of leadership under imaginable pressure. And today, we're going to map out exactly how he navigated the whole shebang.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at exactly how the conflict kicked off. When Lincoln took office, the tension was already at a total boiling point. In his first inaugural address, he says, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." It's a brilliant, highly calculated move. He's speaking directly to the South and placing the heavy responsibility of any impending war squarely on their shoulders. He explicitly tells them, hey, the government is not going to assail you. But he also reminded them that while they had no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, he had the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it.
And that brings us to the stark reality on the ground. On one side, you've got Lincoln's firm, legally grounded defense. Secession is simply illegal. He is sworn to defend federal law and the Union, and yes, he is absolutely willing to use force to do it. But on the flip side, you have the Confederacy's definitive action. They actually fired Confederate batteries on Fort Sumter and forced its surrender. It's a really powerful contrast between Lincoln's constitutional stance and the Confederacy's violent initiation of the Civil War.
Section 1. Humble Beginnings. Fierce Ambition. Who was the man tasked with saving the nation?
Let's move to and see how this builds, because before we get into the battles, we really need to ask, who exactly is this guy leading the country through its darkest hour? Tracing his trajectory reveals a rise that honestly borders on the impossible. Born in 1809 in Kentucky, his father soon moved the family to Indiana. Lincoln later described it as a wild region, with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. Just imagine that. Going from fending off bears in the wilderness to serving as a captain in the Black Hawk War by 1832, and then absolutely rocketing to national fame in 1858 by going toe-to-toe with Stephen A. Douglas.
His law partner once noted something I think is really profound. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. That perfectly captures the relentless internal drive of a man who literally had to struggle for both a living and for learning. By his own admission, when he came of age, he didn't really know much, but somehow he taught himself to read, write, and cipher. That little engine pushed him to just extraordinary lengths to attain knowledge. And man, that drive was forged in the fires of some intense personal struggle. He was born to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Folks, he actually self-deprecatingly called undistinguished families or second families. Tragedy struck super early when his mother died when he was just 10. He worked grueling manual labor on a farm, famously split rails for fences, and kept a store in New Salem, Illinois. From there, he spent 8 years in the state legislature and rode the circuit of courts for years as a lawyer. His personal life was marked by deep sorrow, too. He and Mary Todd had 4 boys, but tragically, only one lived to maturity. Even politically, he faced massive setbacks, like losing that 1858 Senate race to Douglas. But he used that exact momentum to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. These are the grueling milestones that built the man.
Moving on to Section 2, Redefining the Civil War, from preserving the Union to an army of liberation.
All right, jumping back into his presidency, the stakes could not be higher. Lincoln managed to build the Republican Party into a massive national organization, and he rallied Northern Democrats to the Union cause. But we really need to grasp the staggering scale of the crisis they were facing. When Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Ultimately, the map essentially tore in half. 11 Southern states joined the Confederacy, while 4 slaveholding border states actually remained within the Union. The logistical and political nightmare of keeping those border states loyal while simultaneously fighting the South was just immense.
Which brings us to, honestly, one of the most vital questions in all of American history. How did a war that started entirely to save a political union become a fundamental war for human freedom? It definitely didn't happen overnight, and it required a really bold historical pivot by the president.
Well, that turning point is the Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863. It was an executive order declaring that all enslaved people in states that were still in rebellion would henceforth be free. Now, it's really vital to note what this order did not do. It actually didn't address slavery status in those border states we just talked about, nor did it free people in southern areas already under Union control.
So the crucial point is this. Despite its initial limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally transformed the meaning of the entire war. It shifted the whole moral foundation of the conflict. The Union forces were no longer just fighting to put a broken map back together, right? They were suddenly turned into an army of liberation.
200,000. To put that into perspective, that massive number represents a tangible, world-shifting result of the proclamation. African Americans were finally permitted to enlist, and by the end of the war, more than 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had contributed their lives and efforts to this national fight for freedom. It profoundly impacted the outcome of the war.
Section 3. Victory, Peace, and Tragedy. The final chapter, and a shattered vision. As the tide of the war finally, thankfully, began to turn, we enter the final and definitely most poignant chapter of Lincoln's narrative arc. The battlefield victories were coming, but the human cost was almost unbearable to comprehend. But Lincoln completely refused to let the world forget the larger issues at stake. When dedicating the military cemetery at Gettysburg, he delivered these moving words. He asked the nation to highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation would have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. With that, he beautifully cemented the war's ultimate, lasting purpose. And this brilliantly illustrates his mindset. By 1864, Union military triumphs clearly heralded an end to the war, which led to Lincoln's re-election. But rather than seeking vengeance after years and years of bloodshed, his planning for peace was surprisingly flexible and generous. He really wanted to encourage Southerners to lay down their arms and speedily reunite the country.
You can really feel the spirit that guided him in his second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. These famous words are now actually inscribed on a wall of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. They were, without a doubt, his absolute blueprint for a compassionate reconstruction.
But tragically, just as that ultimate victory was finally realized, the whole thing was violently cut short. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington by John Wilkes Booth, an actor who somehow, tragically, believed he was helping his beloved South. Lincoln passed away the very next morning at Peterson House. His remains were brought back to the White House, and a deeply somber funeral service was held in the East Room for the slain president.
And what you really need to take away from this isn't just the obvious tragedy of a life lost, but the profound tragedy of a lost future. With his death went the possibility of peace with magnanimity, that generous, charitable blueprint for healing a broken, bloodied nation. It basically died in that room with him.
So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We've seen how one man's relentless ambition and moral evolution held a country together and literally redefined its core values. But when you look at the messy, incredibly painful history of Reconstruction that followed, without Lincoln's guiding vision of charity for all, how different might the nation's healing have been? It's a monumental what-if of history, and it really reminds us just how fragile democracy is and how deeply individual leadership truly matters. Thank you so much for joining me to explore his incredible story.